The day the lawyer's letter arrived at the Greenbrier County girls' home, every girl in the assembly room laughed. Not quiet laughter, not the polite kind you hide behind your hand. This was the full, ugly, head-thrown-back kind of laughter that fills a room like smoke and makes you feel smaller with every breath. 23 girls, 2 board members, Miss Hargrove at the front podium with the letter in her hand, and all of them laughing at me. Miss Hargrove, with her steel gray bun and her spectacles on a chain and her permanent expression of mild disgust, waited for the noise to die down. Then she folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Eliza, Miss Wren has left you a windblown shack and 11 acres of rock. I suppose even the dead can play a cruel joke." More laughter. Someone behind me whispered, "11 acres of nothing," and someone else repeated it louder. I stood in my borrowed dress with my hands at my sides, and I did not cry. I had learned by then that crying only made things worse. I was 16 years old. My mother, Ruth, had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1911, worn down from sitting up 3 nights with a fevered boarder who wasn't even family. My father, Caleb, was crushed in a timber slide near Quinwood the following spring. After that, I became something to be passed around, like a piece of furniture nobody wanted, but nobody could quite throw away. 6 months with Aunt Irene in Raynell, until her new husband said he hadn't married to feed another mouth. 4 months with the McClure family outside White Sulphur, who liked my sewing but not my questions. 9 months at the Greenbrier County girls' home, where reading after lights out earned you a week of extra chores and a reputation for thinking you were better than everyone else. 3 months with the Blevinses, who sent me back after I corrected their feed ledger in front of a customer. Each placement taught me the same lesson. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut. Don't let them see that you're hungry for something they can't give you. But I couldn't stop reading. Seed catalogs, stove manuals, county bulletins, almanacs, discarded newspapers that I fished from the trash before they burned, government pamphlets on household management that I stole from the library because nobody else wanted them. I read everything I could find, and I remembered everything I read, and that habit, more than anything else, was why people found me difficult. The inheritance, Miss Hargrove explained for the benefit of those who hadn't quite understood the joke, was a property in Laurel Fork, way up in the hills east of Lewisburg. 11 acres of rocky ground on the edge of a sinkhole plain, plus a one-room cabin that leaned worse every winter, and a woodshed with half its roof caved in. The woman who'd left it to me, some great-aunt of my mother's, someone I'd never met, had bought it back in 1889 for $62 and a mule harness nobody else wanted. Ada Wren's Draft Farm, one of the board members said, shaking his head. That's what they call it up in Laurel Fork. I didn't know what that meant. I would learn. The woman spent 20 years digging holes, the board member continued, enjoying himself. Trenches, she called them, for air, if you can believe it. She was going to heat her cabin with dirt. He laughed again, a wet, dismissive sound. Touched, everyone said. Not dangerous, just off. The room rippled with amusement. Another crazy old woman and her worthless land passed down to an orphan girl who would probably starve on it by spring. That was the story they all saw. That was the joke. But something in the lawyer's letter caught my attention. A phrase I'd almost missed, buried in the legal language. Property includes cabin, woodshed, and unfinished improvements. Unfinished. Not failed. Unfinished. Something shifted in my chest. A spark. A question. A pull toward those 11 acres of rock that I couldn't explain and didn't try to. If you want to find out what I did with that wind-blown shack in the hills of West Virginia, how a 16-year-old orphan girl with nothing but a sack of cornmeal and a case of stolen books turned Ada Wren's Draft Farm into the warmest room in the entire valley, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what that strange old woman was building, what she left buried in those 11 acres of rock for someone like me to find, is a story that still lives in those mountains today. I left the Greenbrier County girls' home 4 days later. Miss Hargrove didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved to close the file. The wagon ride to Laurel Fork took most of the day. Mr. Teague, who hauled goods between Lewisburg and the mountain settlements, let me sit on the back beside a stack of fencing wire and 2 barrels of salt pork. He didn't talk much, which suited me fine. I had my case between my knees, my bedding roll behind me, and 1 sack of cornmeal that represented half of everything I owned in the world. The other half was the land I was going to see. The road started well enough, packed dirt, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass. But as we climbed away from the valley floor, things changed. The surface turned to mud-rutted track, then to stone and laurel roots, then to something that barely counted as a road at all, just a gap between the trees where wagons had gone before and worn the weeds down. Mr. Teague glanced back at me when we hit a particularly bad stretch. "You sure this is right?" I nodded. I wasn't sure of anything except that I had nowhere else to go. The last 2 miles, he had to stop twice to clear fallen branches. The November wind cut through my coat like it wasn't there. I could smell wood smoke somewhere, faint and far away, which meant there were other people in these hills. But I couldn't see any houses, couldn't see any sign of human life at all except the wheel ruts we were following. When we finally turned up a side track that Mr. Teague said was the Wren place, I understood why the whole courtroom had laughed. The cabin leaned. Not dramatically, it wasn't falling down, but it leaned like a tired old man who'd been standing too long and had decided to rest one shoulder against an invisible wall. The roof had a sway in the middle that collected leaves and pine needles. One shutter hung by a single hinge. The other was missing entirely. The woodshed was worse. Half the roof had caved in, and what remained was covered in a layer of dead moss that told me nobody had touched it in years. Beyond the shed, I could see the famous sinkhole that had made the land so worthless, a shallow depression in the earth, maybe 30 feet across, where the ground had settled inward over whatever hollow space existed below. "This is it," Mr. Teague said. He didn't make it sound like a question, but it was. This is it. He helped me unload my things onto the porch, what there was of a porch, which was 3 warped boards and a gap where a 4th used to be. Then he tipped his hat, turned the wagon around with difficulty on the narrow track, and left. I stood there listening to the wheels fade until there was nothing but wind and the creak of that one loose shutter. I was 16 years old. I owned 11 acres of rock and a building that looked like it was thinking about becoming a pile of lumber. I had $1.83, a tin spoon, a Bible that had belonged to my mother, and 3 government pamphlets on household management that I'd stolen from the girls' home library because nobody else wanted them. The wind picked up. I went inside. The smell hit me first. Cold ash, mouse droppings, wet wood, iron rust. The particular sour smell of a place that has been empty long enough for emptiness to become its primary characteristic. The cabin was 1 room, maybe 16 feet by 20. A cast iron cook stove dominated the back wall, not the polished black of a cared-for appliance, but the dull gray-brown of neglect. The stovepipe rose through a collar in the ceiling that had been patched with tin and wire so many times it looked like a metal bandage. In the corner, a narrow ladder led up to a loft that I couldn't see from where I stood. A table with 2 chairs, a bed frame with no mattress, shelves on the walls, empty except for dust and a few tins with rusted lids, and the floor. I noticed it because of how I felt standing there. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was coming from below. I could feel it on my ankles, a constant current of freezing air that seemed to pool at floor level and stay there. When I moved toward the stove, the draft followed me. When I walked to the window, it was there too. The whole cabin was a riverbed of cold, and the river flowed straight across the floor from every crack and gap. I tested it. I crouched down by the door and held my hand flat, an inch above the boards. The draft was strong enough to move the loose hairs around my face. That night, I patched the worst gaps in the window with feed sack and nailed a blanket over the door. I lit a fire in the stove with scraps of wood from the collapsed shed roof. The stove drew hard, then sputtered, then drew hard again, like something was blocking and unblocking the airflow. I didn't understand it then. I just knew that the fire burned strange, and the cabin stayed cold. I slept in my coat, my bedding roll pulled tight around me, my mother's Bible under my head because the floor was filthy, and I didn't want it touching the boards. The wind moved the shutter all night, back and forth, like something was trying to get in. On the second day, I explored. The loft was accessible by the ladder, which groaned under my weight but held. Up there, I found what I expected: a sloped ceiling, a small window filmed with dirt, a scatter of old straw that had probably been a mattress once. Mice had been living in it. I could see the evidence in the droppings in the shredded corners. What I didn't expect was the chest. It was pushed against the far wall, half hidden under a piece of oilcloth. A seed chest, the kind farmers used to store winter supplies, with brass corners and a lid that had split down the middle sometime in the years since anyone had opened it. I almost didn't look inside. I was cold, hungry, and already doubting whether coming here had been anything other than a slower way to die than staying at the girls' home. But something made me lift the broken lid. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth and feed sacks, 13 ledgers. They were small, oilcloth covered, each one about the size of a hymnal. I pulled the first one out and opened it. The pages were covered in handwriting, small, precise, slanted to the right. Numbers, diagrams, observations written in a hand that had been educated but not fancy. November 3rd, 1891. First freeze. Floor by the door, cold enough to numb the feet within 10 minutes of waking. Floor by the stove. Tolerable until one lies down, then the draft finds you. Woodpile estimate, 3 cords and a quarter. Began measuring air movement with a candle flame at dawn. I read that entry, and then the next, and then the next. I sat on the loft floor with my coat wrapped around me and read until the light from the dirty window was too dim to see the words. Ada Bell Wren, my mother's great aunt, the woman everyone called crazy, the woman who had left me 11 acres of rock and a cabin that couldn't hold heat. She had been studying the cold. The ledgers were organized by winter, not by year. Each one was titled with the first freeze date and an estimate of the woodpile. They covered 24 years of observations, from 1889 to 1913. 24 winters of notes on stove burns, wind direction, where frost formed on the floor, how much wood vanished during each cold snap. The early entries were practical: measurements, temperatures, fuel consumption. But as I read, I watched them change. January 1894. Observation: the fire requires air. Where does this air come from? It must enter the room from outside. If the room were sealed, the fire would suffocate. Therefore, the stove is not merely burning wood, it is drinking air, drinking cold air. And for every breath the stove takes, the room must exhale warmth through the cracks to replace what has been pulled inward. I stopped reading. I held the ledger in my hands and stared at those words. She had noticed. She had noticed the same thing I had felt on my first night, that constant river of cold across the floor. But she hadn't just noticed it. She had understood it. The fire needed air. So the fire pulled air from outside, through every crack and gap in the walls and floor. And that outside air was freezing. It came in at ground level, where the gaps were, and it stayed at ground level because cold air sinks. So you could burn a fire all night and still wake up with frost on the quilt edge closest to the floor. The heat rose and escaped through the roof. The cold crept in and stayed. I kept reading. March 1897. Hypothesis: if the stove could draw its air from a dedicated source, a pipe, a channel, something controlled, it would stop robbing the room of warmth. The room would stop needing to replace what the stove steals. The draft across the floor would cease. September 1901. Began trench, 3 feet deep. The earth below the frost line is warmer than the air in winter. If the pipe runs through this earth, the air the stove drinks will not be freezing cold. It will be tempered, softened. The fire will still burn, but the fuel will arrive already partially warmed. October 1901. Pipe sections purchased. 6-inch vitrified clay. Same material used for sewer lines. Will not rot. Will not burn. Will not crack in the heat of summer or the cold of winter. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though I was cold, but from something else, from understanding. Ada Wren had spent 24 years studying the one thing everyone else ignored, the path the cold took into a room. She hadn't tried to seal every crack. She hadn't tried to burn more wood. She had tried to change the route, to give the stove a different source of air, one that didn't come howling through the floor. And she had left her work for someone to find. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the ledgers, I found 3 more things. 2 stove grates still wrapped in oilcloth, a wooden box containing iron fittings and clay collars, and a letter. The letter was sealed. The envelope was addressed to the Greenbrier County Girls' Home, Lewisburg, West Virginia. It had never been mailed. I broke the seal. To whom it may concern, I'm writing to inquire about a girl named Eliza Rowan, who I understand was placed in your care following the death of her parents. Eliza is the granddaughter of my niece Ruth, which makes her my family, though we have never met. I'm an old woman living alone on a small property in Laurel Fork. I have no children. I have spent many years on a project of home improvement that requires careful observation and detailed record keeping. I'm looking for a girl who is bookish, as Ruth was, and who might benefit from work that uses the mind as much as the hands. If such a girl exists in your care, I would be grateful if you would send her to me for a summer that I might assess whether she could be trained in my methods and eventually inherit my property and my work. I am not asking for charity. I am offering an opportunity. Yours sincerely, Ada Bell Wren. The letter was dated March of 1912, nearly 3 years before Ada died. I sat in that cold loft holding that letter, and I understood something terrible. Miss Hargrove had received this. She had read it. She had decided that placing a girl with an eccentric old woman in the hills would ruin my chances of a respectable situation. And she had filed it away without ever telling me. Ada Wren had asked. She had seen Ruth in me, or imagined she might, and she had reached out. And the woman who controlled my life had thrown that connection away like junk mail. I cried, not quietly. I sat on that loft floor and sobbed until my throat ached and my nose ran, and the light through the dirty window turned from gray to almost nothing. I cried for the years I could have had in this cabin learning from a woman who thought the way I thought. I cried for Ada, who had waited for an answer that never came and had died alone in a wagon accident before she could try again. And then I stopped. I looked at the ledgers spread around me. 13 books, 24 winters. One final diagram rolled up and weighted by a stove grate that I hadn't yet unrolled. I picked up that diagram and spread it flat on the loft floor. Shed intake. Completed if help can be had. It was a drawing of the cabin, the woodshed, and the underground pipe that connected them. 42 feet of 6-inch clay tile running from the shed floor to the stove's lower draft chamber. The pipe was marked in segments. The depth, 3 feet below the frost line, was noted at multiple points. Arrows showed the direction of airflow. A small note in Ada's handwriting read, "System complete by first freeze. God willing." God had not been willing. Ada had died in October of 1913, thrown from a wagon on a frozen creek crossing, and her system had died with her. Until now. I folded the diagram carefully and tucked it into my coat. I gathered the ledgers and carried them down the ladder, one stack at a time, setting them on the table beside the cold stove. I didn't have money. I didn't have tools. I didn't know how to lay pipe or dig a trench through rocky ground. I didn't know if Ada's idea would even work. But I knew something no one else in Laurel Fork knew. Ada Wren hadn't been crazy. She had been right. Before I could dig anything, I had to survive. The first week nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. I had 1 sack of cornmeal, which I stretched by boiling it thin and eating 2 small portions a day. I had no meat, no milk, no eggs, no vegetables. The apples in the loft were withered and soft, but I ate them anyway, cores and all, because every bite was a bite I didn't have to figure out how to find. The cold was a separate problem. I burned wood from the collapsed shed roof, but it was wet and punky and smoked more than it burned. The stove coughed and sputtered and never really got hot. At night, the floor was so cold I could feel the chill through my blankets, through my coat, through my dress. I woke every few hours to feed the fire, and every time I woke I was colder than the time before. I lost weight. I didn't have much to lose. My dresses, already loose, started to hang. My face in the clouded mirror above the wash basin looked sharper, older, harder. On the 6th day, I caught a rabbit in a snare I'd set near the tree line. I didn't know how to set snares, not really, but one of the government pamphlets I'd stolen from the home had a diagram. The rabbit was thin and stringy, but I boiled it for hours with the last of my cornmeal, and that pot of soup was the best thing I'd tasted in months. But I couldn't live on occasional rabbits and withered apples, and winter was coming fast. I walked to Laurel Fork on the 8th day, 7 miles downhill mostly. The road improved as I went, which meant it was worse going back than coming, but I needed supplies, and more than that, I needed to know what people said about Ada Wren. The general store was run by a man named Ephraim Kessler. He had gray whiskers and small eyes and a way of looking at you like he was calculating what you were worth. When I walked in, he watched me from behind the counter without saying hello. "I'm Eliza Rowan," I said. "I've inherited the Wren place." He didn't laugh exactly. It was more like a snort, a small noise in the back of his throat that said he'd already heard the joke and didn't think it was funny enough to deserve a full laugh. "Ada Wren's draft farm," he said. "That's what folks call it, or called it when she was alive. Haven't heard anyone mention the place in a year." "What do you mean, draft farm?" "She dug trenches," he said. "For air," she said, "not water, air. She was going to heat her cabin with dirt, if you believed her." He shook his head. Everyone thought she was touched. Not mean touched, just off. She'd come in here with her notebooks and her measurements, talking about stove draft and frost lines, and people would just... He made a gesture like someone shooing away a fly. "Did anyone ever see what she built?" "Nothing to see. She dug some holes and filled them back in, laid some pipe that didn't go anywhere, spent money she didn't have on clay tiles and stovepipe cement." He looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You planning to farm rock, girl, because that's all she left you." I bought flour, lard, salt, and a small sack of dried beans with my last $1.30. I carried them 7 miles uphill in the dark because I'd stayed too long asking questions. The load cut into my shoulders. My feet blistered. Twice I thought about sitting down and not getting up, but I kept thinking about Ada's diagram. Shed intake completed. If help can be had, she hadn't finished. Everyone thought she'd failed, but she hadn't failed. She died. Those were different things. Winter settled in hard by mid-November. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, snow fell. Not heavy, but steady. A thin white blanket that turned to ice overnight and stayed for days. The path to the road became treacherous. The path to the spring seep, where I got my water, became almost impassable. I stopped going anywhere. I stayed in the cabin with my fire and my ledgers and my thoughts. I read Ada's notes from the beginning again, looking for anything I'd missed. I studied her diagrams. I traced the path of her proposed pipe with my finger, trying to understand why she'd routed it the way she had. One entry stopped me cold. December 14th, 1906. The coldest night so far. Frost on the quilt edge at dawn. Fire never went out, but the floor was a river. I lay in bed and watched my breath turn to fog, and I thought, I am heating the sky. The stove is working perfectly, and I am heating the sky. All the warmth rises, all the cold stays. The fire drinks the room and gives nothing back but smoke. I am going to stop fighting the cold. I am going to change its path. What freezes a room is not always the cold outside, Ada wrote in a later entry. Sometimes it is the path you let the cold take. I read that line, and I said it aloud in the empty cabin, and something shifted in my chest. She had understood. She had seen what no one else saw, that the problem wasn't the cold itself. The problem was where the cold was allowed to go, and she had spent 24 years trying to solve it. I wasn't going to let her work die with her. The trench could wait until spring. The ground was frozen too hard to dig, but the stove I could work on now. I spent 3 days in the cold shed, examining the floor where Ada's diagram showed the intake beginning. The boards were rotted in places, but solid in others. Through the gaps, I could see soil and stone, and when I cleared the debris, I found the mouth of a pipe. 6-inch vitrified clay, just as the ledgers described, clogged with dirt and leaves and a dead mouse that had probably been there for years. I cleaned it out with my hands, then with a stick, then with a piece of wire I'd salvaged from the shed roof. When I was done, I could see darkness going down, the pipe descending into the earth, heading toward the cabin. The other end was harder to find. I had to move the stove, which weighed more than I did and hadn't been moved in years. The iron feet were rusted to the floor. I pried them loose with the fireplace poker, inch by inch, terrified the whole time that I'd crack the stove or tip it over or set the cabin on fire. When I finally got it clear, I found the hole. A 6-inch opening in the floor directly beneath where the stove's lower cleanout had been sitting. The opening had been sealed with tin and cement, but the seal was cracked. Ada had been working on the connection when she died. In the wooden box from the loft, I found the collar she'd been fitting. An iron piece, handmade, designed to connect the clay pipe to the stove's intake. It was unfinished, the cement seal was missing, and one of the mounting holes hadn't been drilled, but it was close. So close. I worked on that collar for 2 weeks. I drilled the missing hole with a hand auger I found in the shed. I mixed cement from a bag Ada had stored beneath the oilcloth. I fitted and refitted the collar until it sat flush against both the pipe and the stove's intake chamber. On the first day of December, I lit a fire in the newly connected stove and lay down on the floor with a candle stub next to the door. The flame didn't lean inward. For the first time since I'd arrived, the flame stood straight. The change wasn't dramatic at first. The cabin didn't suddenly become warm. The floor didn't stop being cold. But something was different, and I could feel it in the way the fire burned. Before, the stove had pulled and sputtered, drawn hard and then weak, like someone breathing through a straw. Now it drew steady, even. The draft wasn't fighting against whatever air was leaking in through the walls. It was pulling from one direction only, the pipe. I spent the next week testing. I held my hand over the intake collar and felt air moving, cool air, but not freezing, not the knife-sharp cold of the wind outside. This air had traveled through the earth. It had been tempered by soil that stayed the same temperature year-round, regardless of what was happening on the surface. I measured everything I could. I counted how many armloads of wood the stove burned in a day and compared it to my notes from the first weeks. I put my hand on the floor by the bed at dawn and at dusk and at midnight. The numbers changed, not dramatically, but enough. Before the connection, 12 armloads of wood lasted about 4 days in hard weather. After the connection, closer to 5. Before the connection, the floor by the bed was cold enough to numb my feet in minutes. After, I could stand there barefoot without pain. It was working. Ada's system was working. I sat on the floor of the cabin, the floor that had been a river of cold for weeks, and was now, for the first time, something I could tolerate, and I cried. Not from sadness, from relief so sharp it felt like pain. The problem was the trench. Ada's system was incomplete. The pipe ran from the cabin to somewhere beneath the shed, but the section she'd drawn, the buried intake under the shed floor, the connection to outside air through controlled gaps in the boards, had never been finished. What I'd found was a pipe with a dead mouse in it and a hole in the earth that let in whatever air happened to wander down. For the system to work the way Ada had designed it, the intake needed to be finished. The pipe needed to start at the shed floor, not in the dirt beneath it, and the shed floor needed to be rebuilt with gaps between the boards to let air enter without letting snow and debris clog the system. I couldn't do that work in winter. The ground was frozen, my tools were insufficient, and even if I could dig, I didn't have the materials I needed: more pipe, more cement, lumber for the new floor. I wrote a list of what I would need and tucked it into the first ledger. Then I went back to surviving. January was brutal. February was worse. I ate what I could find: dried beans stretched with snow melt water, thin soups made from bones I'd boiled 3 times already, the occasional squirrel when my snares worked. I lost more weight. My dresses hung on me like sacks. My hands, which had never been soft, became something else entirely: red, cracked, calloused in new places. When I looked at them by firelight, they didn't look like a girl's hands anymore. But I didn't die. The cabin held heat better now. Not perfectly, there were still drafts, still cold spots, still mornings when I woke with my breath frosting in front of my face. But the floor was better. The constant river of cold had become a trickle. I could sleep without waking every 2 hours to feed the fire. I read Ada's ledgers over and over. I studied her diagrams. I made my own notes in the margins, questions and observations and ideas for improvements. I talked to her, sometimes out loud, as if she could hear me through the pages. "You were right," I told her one night, sitting by the stove with the snow falling outside. "You were right about all of it." She didn't answer, but I felt somehow that she was listening. Spring came slow and reluctant, the way it does in the mountains. The snow melted. The road turned to mud. The spring seep behind the shed ran clear and cold with meltwater, and the ground, the frozen, impossible ground, began to soften. On the first day warm enough to work without gloves, I started digging. The trench needed to be 3 feet deep and 42 feet long. 3 feet to get below the frost line, where the earth held a steady temperature year-round. 42 feet from the shed to the stove, though 30 of those feet were already piped. I needed to extend the line 12 feet further, from where it currently ended to the center of the shed floor. I had one shovel, a spade I'd found in the shed, rusted but serviceable after I'd cleaned and sharpened it with a stone. I had no wheelbarrow, no help, no money to hire help even if I'd wanted to. I dug. The first 3 feet were easy, topsoil and rotted leaves, but then I hit rock. This was limestone country, and the rock came up in slabs and chunks that I had to pry loose with the edge of the spade and haul out by hand. Every foot down took longer than the last. My shoulders ached, my back seized up. Blisters formed on my palms, broke, and formed again. By the end of the first week, I dug 6 feet of trench. By the end of the second, 8. By the end of the third, I was sick with fever and couldn't get out of bed for 4 days. When the fever broke, I went back to digging. On a Tuesday morning in late April, I was standing in the trench, waist deep now, arms aching, face streaked with mud, when I heard someone coming up the path. I climbed out fast, shovel in hand. Nobody came to the Wren place. Nobody had any reason to. The only people who knew I was here were Mr. Kessler at the store and the occasional neighbor I'd passed on the road. The man who emerged from the tree line was old, 70 at least, maybe older. He had white hair under a battered hat, a stonemason's build, broad shoulders gone soft but still solid, and a walking stick that he used more for poking at the ground than for support. He stopped at the edge of the cleared area and looked at me. "You're Ruth's girl," he said. I gripped the shovel tighter. "I'm Eliza Rowan." "I know who you are." He walked closer, studying the trench, the pile of dirt and rock beside it, the pipe sections I'd salvaged from the shed and laid out in order of use. "I knew Ada. Helped her set the stove hearth, years back. Hauled limestone for her a few times." He looked up at me. "She told me what she was doing. I didn't believe her. Not fully. But I never laughed at her either." "Who are you?" "Silus Boon." He nodded toward the trench. "You're digging wrong." I felt my face flush. "I'm digging the only way I know how." "I can see that." He walked to the edge of the trench and looked down. "Your grade's off. Pipe needs to run slightly downhill toward the shed, so any water that gets in will drain out instead of freezing in the line. You've got it level." I stared at him. I'd never thought about drainage. "Show me," I said. Silus Boon became my teacher. He was 72 years old, retired from stonework after the quarry dust had taken most of his wind. He'd lost his son to a blasting accident at the lime kiln. His wife had died years before that. He lived alone in a cabin 3 miles down the ridge and spent his days doing nothing in particular. "Your aunt wasn't chasing heat," he told me on the third day when we'd corrected the grade and begun laying the extended pipe. "She was chasing where heat gets robbed." That's what she wrote. That the problem isn't the cold, it's the path the cold takes. He nodded. She was right. I saw it once. Came by to drop off a load of flat stone for her hearth, and she made me stand in the cabin while she lit a fire. held a candle down by the floor and showed me how the flame leaned in, said the stove was drinking the house. He shook his head. I thought she was dramatic, but she wasn't. She was precise. We worked together for the rest of April and into May. He showed me how to bed pipe in stone, pack gravel around joints for drainage, seal connections with stove cement that would hold against moisture and temperature changes. He taught me to read the angle of a floor with nothing but a level and my own eyes. He shared what he knew, not as a favor, but as if it was the most natural thing in the world, passing knowledge downhill the way water runs. "Why are you helping me?" I asked him once. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Because Ada asked for help once, and nobody came, and because my hands still remember how to work, even if my lungs don't." By June, the trench was finished, 42 feet of buried pipe, running from the center of the rebuilt shed floor to the intake collar at the stove. 3 feet below the frost line for its entire length, graded slightly downhill toward the shed for drainage, connected at both ends with iron fittings and cement seals that Silus and I had checked and rechecked until we were satisfied. The shed floor was new, planks with deliberate gaps between them, wide enough to let air pass through, but narrow enough to keep snow and debris out. A wire screen underneath the gaps caught anything that fell through. The whole setup was simple, ugly, and exactly what Ada had drawn in her final diagram. On the first test burn, I lit dry oak shavings in the stove and went to the shed. I put my hand above the floor gaps and felt air moving down, a steady pull. The stove was breathing through the pipe, through the earth, through the shed floor, drawing its oxygen from outside without stealing it from the room. I went back to the cabin and lay flat on the floor by the door. I held a candle flame steady in the draft that used to roar through the gap. The flame didn't move. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for Silus to finish whatever he was doing in the shed and come find me. He stood in the doorway and looked at me lying on the floor like a fool, tears running down my temples into my hair. "It works," I said. "I know." He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face softened. "Your aunt knew it would." The summer of 1915 passed in a blur of work. Silus and I sealed the worst cracks in the cabin walls with clay and oakum, leaving enough controlled leakage near the ceiling to prevent stale air. We rebuilt the stove hearth with flat stone that would hold heat longer. We split and stacked wood, 4 full ranks of seasoned oak, and built a rough roof over the wood pile to keep it dry. I measured everything: wood consumption, floor temperatures at different heights, how long the cabin held heat after the fire died down. I filled one of Ada's blank ledgers with my own notes, my own observations, my own small improvements. The numbers were clear. Before the system, 12 armloads of wood lasted 4 days in cold weather, and the floor by the bed was dangerous. After the system, the same wood lasted 6 days, and the floor was tolerable, not warm, but not a river of ice. The cabin had changed. I had changed it. But summer was easy. Summers didn't kill people. What I'd built was going to be tested when the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, and the whole valley settled in for the long cold. "We'll know by Christmas," Silus said one evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of weak coffee. "If it holds through a hard freeze, it'll hold through anything." I looked out at the ridge, at the trees already showing the first faint colors of early autumn. What if it doesn't hold? "Then you'll fix it and try again. That's what Ada did. That's what everyone does who isn't a fool." I wanted to believe him, but the fear was there, under everything, a small, cold voice that wondered if all my work was going to collapse the moment real winter arrived. The first hard freeze came in late November. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night. Ice rimmed the water bucket in the cabin. Frost covered the inside of the windows. The wind came down from the ridge like it was angry about something, and had decided to take it out on anyone stupid enough to live up here. I lit the stove at dusk and didn't go to bed. I sat on the floor by the door with my candle and my notebook, and I watched, waited, felt for the old draft that used to howl through every crack. The flame stood straight. I put my hand flat on the floor. Cool, but not cold. Not the numbing freeze I remembered from my first winter here. I opened the stove door and felt the heat of the fire against my face. The flames burned steady and even, no sputtering, no gasping. The stove was breathing through the pipe, through the earth, and it didn't need to steal the warmth I was trying to keep. By midnight, I was crying again. By morning, I was asleep on the floor, my head on my coat, the fire still burning steady. Silus came the next day, coughing through the cold air. "Well?" he asked from the doorway. I stood in the center of the cabin, barefoot, arms spread. "Feel the floor." He stomped off his boots and stepped inside. I watched his face as he walked from the door to the stove and back again. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "It holds. The pipe holds. The floor it's not perfect, but Silus, it's not freezing. I slept through the night. I didn't have to feed the fire every 2 hours." He walked to the stove and put his hand on the collar where the pipe connected. "Air's moving, you can feel it, coming up through the earth, already warmed by the time it reaches the fire." 52 degrees, I said. "I measured it last night with a thermometer Ada left in the chest. The air coming through the pipe is 52 degrees. Outside, it was 12. He looked at me. His eyes were wet, and I realized he wasn't just proud. He was grieving. "She should have seen this," he said. "Ada should have been here for this." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. We stood there in the warm cabin, the fire burning steady, the floor no longer a river of cold, and we didn't say anything else for a long time. But the real test hadn't come yet. What I'd built had survived one hard freeze. It hadn't survived a full winter. It hadn't survived the kind of cold that killed livestock and froze people in their beds. That test was still 2 years away. The winter of 1915 into 1916 was hard, but I was ready for it. Silus came by every few days when the weather allowed. He taught me things I couldn't have learned from books: how to read the color of wood smoke to know if your fire was burning clean, how to feel the draft in a room with your eyes closed, how to tap a stovepipe joint and hear whether the seal was good. He brought tools I didn't have: a proper level, a mason's trowel, a set of chisels he'd used for 30 years and could no longer grip for long. "My hands remember," he said once, watching me work a stubborn joint, "but they don't obey like they used to." His backstory came out in pieces. He'd been a stonemason and lime burner most of his life. Good work, steady work, the kind of work that built foundations and lasted. His son had followed him into the trade, a boy named Daniel, who'd been better with stone than Silus ever was. Quicker hands, better eye. The blasting accident was in '06, Silus told me one afternoon, sitting on an overturned bucket while I reset the stove hearth. Charge went early. Wasn't anyone's fault, which somehow made it worse. If I'd had someone to blame, I could have stayed angry, but there wasn't anyone, just bad luck and a boy who deserved better. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. After that, the kiln dust got me. Already had, probably, but I'd been ignoring it. Couldn't ignore it anymore. Couldn't work. Couldn't do much of anything except sit in my cabin and wait to die. He looked at me with those watery blue eyes. Then you showed up digging a trench wrong, and I thought, well, at least there's something worth doing. His cough was bad some days. He'd stop in the middle of a sentence and hack into his handkerchief, and I'd see the flecks of pink in the cloth that he thought I didn't notice. He was dying. Not fast, but steady. I knew it. He knew I knew it. We didn't talk about it. By spring of 1916, I had improved the system twice. The first improvement was a simple screen box under the shed floor, wire mesh stretched over a wooden frame that caught leaves and debris before they could clog the pipe. Silus helped me build it. The second improvement was my own idea, deepening 12 feet of the line where I'd noticed the ground froze deeper than expected during the coldest weeks. I dug alone, in March mud, while Silus sat on a stump and told me I was stubborn as a mule and twice as useful. The numbers kept getting better. Wood consumption that second winter, down to roughly 2 cords for the whole season, where I'd burned nearly 3 the year before. Floor temperature by the bed on the coldest nights. 51 degrees instead of near freezing. Time the cabin held comfortable heat after the fire died. 4 hours instead of 1. I wrote everything down. I filled a second ledger. I started sketching improvements I couldn't afford yet, a better intake hood, a secondary pipe for the stove's upper draft, a stone heat sink behind the hearth that would store warmth and release it slowly. Ada's system was becoming mine. Not everyone was pleased. In late summer of 1916, I walked to Kessler's store for stovepipe cement and salt. The porch was full of men, farmers, and timber workers waiting out the heat of the day, talking about weather and crops, and who owed what to whom. Ephraim Kessler was behind the counter when I came in. He looked at me the way he always did, like I was a stray dog that kept turning up no matter how many times he shooed it away. "More cement," he said. "You planning to heat with dirt for another year?" I put my coins on the counter. "The system works." "So you keep saying." He reached for a tin of cement but didn't hand it over. "People talk, you know. They say you're up there doing strange things. Digging holes, sealing pipes, spending money you don't have on clay and iron." "People can talk all they want. They say Ada Wren was touched, and you're touched, too. They say you're going to burn that cabin down with your fool experiments." I felt my face flush. Have I burned anything down? Not yet. Have I asked anyone for help? Not that I've heard. Then what business is it of theirs, what I do on my own land? Ephraim set the cement down with a thunk. "It's not business. It's entertainment. You're the most interesting thing that's happened in Laurel Fork since Jeb Tucker's mule kicked the preacher." He took my coins and made change. "Don't mind them. They'll find something else to talk about soon enough." But I did mind. I minded because they were laughing at me the same way they'd laughed at Ada. And I minded because I knew something they didn't. The system worked. It worked better every year. And sooner or later, something was going to prove it. The proving came faster than I expected. That October, a man named Jonas Prit rode up my path. I knew who he was. Everyone knew Jonas Prit. He owned the land that bordered mine to the south. Better land, flatter, with actual soil instead of rock. He was part-time constable, part-time landowner, full-time opinion about everyone else's business. He'd been trying to buy Ada's property for years before she died, offering pennies on the dollar and getting refused every time. He sat on his horse at the edge of my cleared ground and looked at the trench I'd been digging, a drainage extension. Nothing important, like it was a personal insult. "You're undermining the ground," he said. I wiped my hands on my apron. "I'm digging a drainage line." "You're digging holes all over this property. I've seen the other trenches. You're going to cause a collapse." "The other trenches are filled and packed. They're more stable than they were before." "That's not what I heard." He shifted in his saddle. "I heard you're piping poison air from the sinkhole into your cabin. I heard you're burning some kind of strange fuel that doesn't use regular wood. I heard—" "You heard nonsense." I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't look away either. "What I'm doing is exactly what my aunt was doing, improving my stove's air supply. There's nothing poisonous about it. There's nothing strange. It's pipe and earth and air, and it works." "If it works, why doesn't anyone else do it?" "Because no one else thought to try." Jonas Prit stared at me for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not a kind smile, not an amused smile, just a showing of teeth. "Fill that trench," he said, "or I'll have the county look into it. I'm sure they'd be interested in what kind of unsafe construction an orphan girl is doing on property that probably should have been sold for back taxes years ago." He turned his horse and rode back down the path. I watched him go, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. "Let them look," I said to the empty air. "Let them look at every inch." They didn't look. Jonas Prit made noise, but he didn't follow through. I think he expected me to fold, expected me to fill in my work and apologize, and maybe even sell him the land for whatever he offered. When I didn't, he seemed to lose interest. Or maybe he was just waiting for me to fail in a way that didn't require any effort on his part. The fall of 1917 brought a visitor I hadn't expected. Her name was Professor Miriam Vale. She was 38 years old, a domestic science instructor from the State Agricultural Extension, and she'd been traveling the mountain counties teaching women about nutrition, canning, and household efficiency. Someone in Lewisburg had mentioned the strange heating system in Laurel Fork. She'd come to see for herself. I was splitting wood when she appeared at the edge of the clearing, a tall woman in a practical gray dress, with a notebook under her arm and a pencil behind her ear. "Miss Rowan?" I set down the axe. "That's me." "I'm told you've built something unusual here, something to do with your stove and an underground pipe." I didn't answer right away. I'd had enough of people calling my work strange or dangerous or touched. But there was something different about this woman. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't skeptical. She was curious. "Would you like to see it?" I asked. Professor Vale spent 3 hours in my cabin. She examined the stove connection. She walked the line of the buried pipe, poking at the soil with her boot. She went into the shed and knelt on the floor, feeling the air movement through the gaps. She took notes the whole time, pages and pages, her pencil moving fast. "You've essentially created a dedicated combustion air supply," she said finally, standing in my kitchen with her notebook open. "The stove draws oxygen from the pipe instead of from the room. Because the pipe runs underground, the air arrives tempered by the earth. 50 degrees, you said?" 52 on average, 55 in summer, 50 in deep winter. The earth doesn't change much below the frost line. "And this reduces your wood consumption because the stove isn't fighting against cold replacement air." I nodded. "Before the system, I burned almost 3 cords a winter. Now it's closer to 2, maybe less this year depending on the weather." Professor Vale closed her notebook and looked at me. "Miss Rowan, this is remarkable. You didn't merely keep warm, you changed the draft equation." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. Nobody had ever looked at my work and called it what it was, a solution. Not a strange experiment, not a fool's errand, a solution. "My aunt figured most of it out," I said. "I just finished what she started." "Then your aunt was a remarkable woman." Professor Vale tucked her notebook under her arm. "I'd like to write about this. A circular for the extension office. I'll credit you both Ada Wren for the original design and Eliza Rowan for the completion. Would that be acceptable?" I felt something crack open in my chest, something I'd been holding tight for years. "Yes," I said. "That would be more than acceptable." Professor Vale published her circular in October of 1917. I don't know how many people read it, but she sent me a copy, and I kept it in Ada's chest with the ledgers. Proof. Written proof that what we'd built was real and sound and worth knowing about. That same month, the first hints of the coming winter started to show. The almanac called for cold. Farmers were worried about early frost. There was talk in town about the wells being low, which was unusual for fall but not alarming. Everyone assumed the wells would recover when the rains came. "The wells are fine," Ephraim Kessler said when I stopped in for flour. "They're always fine. It's just a dry spell." I didn't argue with him, but I remembered something Silus had said about mountain weather, that the valleys had long memories and short attention spans, and that anyone who thought they knew what winter would bring was either a prophet or a fool. The winter of 1917 into 1918 started hard and got worse. The first freeze came in early December. Not unusual. Then a deeper cold settled in, the kind that turned water buckets to solid ice overnight and made the trees crack like rifle shots in the dark. Then more cold. Then more. The temperature dropped and kept dropping, and the weather that everyone expected to break just didn't. By Christmas, it was clear this wasn't a normal winter. The wells went first. The Petersons' well froze solid on December 22nd, then the Hendersons on the 26th, then 3 more before New Year's. The creeks that usually ran all winter slowed to trickles and then stopped. The spring seep behind my shed, which had never failed, dropped to a weak dribble that I had to collect in a bowl and wait for. The cold reached record depths. I heard later that Lewisburg hit 37 degrees below zero on the 30th of December. I believe it. On the ridge, with the wind cutting through everything, it felt colder than any air had a right to be. And the wood. The wood vanished. Families who'd thought their piles were sufficient found themselves burning through a week's supply in 2 days. Men who'd split what they needed in the fall went back to the trees with axes, desperately cutting green wood that smoked and sputtered and gave half the heat of seasoned fuel. The Tuckers lost 2 milk cows that froze standing up in a barn that couldn't hold warmth. I watched it happen from my cabin on the ridge. I watched the smoke rising from chimneys all over the valley, watched it rise and rise, knowing that every wisp meant someone burning faster than they could afford to, someone losing the race against cold that wouldn't end. My stove burned steady. My cabin held heat. My floor stayed tolerable, not warm, but not deadly. The system I'd spent 3 years building did exactly what Ada had designed it to do. It stopped the cold from taking the path it wanted, and it forced it to take a different one. I had wood. I had shelter. I had warmth. And all around me, people were freezing. Silus nearly died in the first week of January. I found him collapsed in his dooryard, half frozen, his lungs so full of fluid that every breath sounded like someone drowning. I got him onto a sled, I don't know how, I was half his size, and dragged him 3 miles through snow that reached my thighs in places, up the ridge to my cabin. I put him by the stove and piled blankets on him and fed him broth that he couldn't taste and water that he couldn't swallow. For 3 days I thought he was dying. On the 4th day, he opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and said, "This floor is warm." "I know." "Clear to the corners." "I know." He closed his eyes again. Ada would have been proud. I didn't sleep much that week. I split wood. I fed the fire. I boiled water and made soup and changed Silas's blankets when they got damp with sweat. I listened to the wind howl and thought about all the cabins in the valley where the wind was howling inside too, where the floors were rivers of cold, where children were sleeping in their coats because there wasn't enough heat to warm them. The system worked. My cabin was the warmest room in Laurel Fork, and I didn't know what to do with that. The first person to ask for help was Miss Hargrove. She arrived on a sleigh in the 2nd week of January, her steel gray bun covered by a scarf, her face red with cold, and something else, something like shame. I saw her coming up the track and didn't believe it at first. The matron of the Greenbrier County Girls' Home didn't make social calls. She certainly didn't make social calls to the orphan girls she'd dismissed as hopeless cases. But here she was, standing in my dooryard in the brutal cold, looking at the smoke rising steady from my chimney while all around us the valley froze. "Miss Rowan." She couldn't quite meet my eyes. "I've come to ask a favor. Come inside." I stepped back from the door. "You'll freeze out there." She came in. She stood in my cabin and looked around at the stove burning steady, at the floor that wasn't leaking cold, at Silas wrapped in blankets on the bed, at the pots of water I kept heating to have steam in the air. "It's warm," she said, like she hadn't expected it, like she'd come here and assumed she'd find me freezing like everyone else. "It is." "The home." She stopped, swallowed, started again. "The home's coal shipment is delayed. The roads are impassable. We've closed off the upper dormitory, but even so, we can't keep the younger girls warm enough. They're sleeping 4 to a bed and still shivering." I waited. "I came to ask if—" Another pause. "If you might have any advice, any suggestions, anything that might help us keep those children warm until the weather breaks." I could have made her beg. I thought about it for exactly 1 second. I thought about the assembly room where she'd stood in front of everyone and told me the dead had played a cruel joke on me. I thought about the letters she'd thrown away, the connection she'd severed, the years I could have had with Ada. Then I thought about the children, 12 years old, 14, 10, shivering in the dark, wondering if anyone was going to save them. "Oh, bring them here," I said, "in shifts if you need to. They can warm up during the day and go back at night, or stay if there's room. We'll figure it out." Miss Hargrove stared at me. I think she'd expected me to refuse. I think she'd expected cruelty because cruelty was what she would have given in my place. "You would do that?" "Why wouldn't I? After everything She stopped. Her eyes were wet. "After what I said to you, what I did. That was 3 years ago. Those children weren't even there." I opened the door. "Go get them before they freeze to death." The line grew. Miss Hargrove brought 9 girls from the home that first day. They came in shifts. 3 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, 3 in the evening, rotating through my cabin like it was a warming station, which I suppose it was. They ate soup and thawed their fingers by the stove and slept on pallets I made from feed sacks and old clothes. Then Mrs. Kessler came, the shopkeeper's wife carrying her grandson, a boy of maybe 2 with a cough that had turned deep and wet. "They said your floor doesn't freeze," she said, standing in the doorway. "They said the baby might sleep here without coughing." "Put him by the stove. The warmest spot is near the intake collar." Then the Tucker family, who'd lost their cows and were burning furniture to stay warm. Then the widow Ames, who'd once told me that reading by candlelight was vanity and waste. She came with nothing but a blanket and eyes that begged without saying a word. I let them all in. I let in the Bakers, who'd put me out of their house after 3 months because I asked too many questions. I let in the Hendersons, who'd laughed at Ada's draft farm for years. I let in families I'd never met, who came because they'd heard there was a warm cabin on the ridge, a place where the cold couldn't reach. Silas watched from the bed, too weak to help, but strong enough to comment. "They don't deserve it," he said one night, when the cabin was full of sleeping bodies and the fire was burning low. "Most of them laughed at your aunt. Some of them laughed at you." I was standing by the stove, feeding it the last of the evening's wood. Maybe not. Then why do it? Why let them in? I thought about it. I thought about Ada's letter, the one that had never been mailed. I thought about the years I'd spent being passed from family to family, house to house, always unwanted, always too much trouble. I thought about what it felt like to be cold in a room full of people who had warmth and wouldn't share it. "Warmth is like water," I said finally. "It does its best work when it moves toward the people who need it." Silas didn't say anything, but I saw him nod slow and small before he closed his eyes. Jonas Prit came on the last day of January. He didn't come himself, not at first. He sent his hired hand, a young man named Thomas, who'd been working Prit's land for 2 seasons. Thomas showed up at my door with white patches on 2 of his toes and a look on his face that was half shame and half desperation. "Mr. Prit says you might have room by your fire," Thomas said. "He says he'd consider it a favor. He says he'd pay." I looked at his feet. The white patches were frostbite, another day or 2, and he'd lose those toes entirely. "I don't want his money," I said. "Come in." Thomas stayed for 3 days. I gave him the warmest corner, the one nearest the stove, and made him keep his feet elevated near the heat. The color came back slowly, painfully. He cried one night from the agony of blood returning to tissue that had nearly died, and I sat with him and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. On the 4th day, Jonas Prit himself rode up the path. I met him in the dooryard. I didn't invite him inside. "My man Thomas says you've been good to him." Jonas sat on his horse, looking down at me. "I came to offer my thanks." "Your thanks aren't necessary." "Maybe not, but they're offered." He paused. Something moved behind his eyes. Not kindness exactly, but something close to it. Something like the recognition that he'd been wrong. "I said things about this place, about you, about what you were building here." "You did." "I was wrong." The words came out like he was pulling teeth. "I don't know how you did it, the pipe, the air, whatever it is, but I was wrong. This cabin shouldn't be the warmest place in the valley, but it is. And you've been letting people in who have no claim on your kindness." I didn't say anything. I just waited. "I'm not going to apologize," Jonas said finally. "That's not my nature, but I'm not going to cause you any more trouble either. You've earned your place here." He turned his horse and rode away. I watched him go, feeling something strange in my chest. Not satisfaction, exactly. Just completion. One more account settled. One more doubter forced to see. The cold broke in mid-February. It didn't warm up, not really, not for weeks, but the brutal edge softened. The wells started to recover. The roads became passable. The families who'd been sleeping on my floor went back to their own homes, one by one, carrying with them the memory of a cabin that shouldn't have been warm, but was. Silas recovered slowly. His lungs were never the same. They'd been failing for years before the cold snap, and the crisis had pushed them closer to the edge. But he could walk again by March, could sit on the porch, and watch me work by April. "You saved a lot of people this winter," he said one afternoon, when the first hints of spring were softening the snow. "The system saved them. I just opened the door. Same thing." He coughed into his handkerchief, softer than before, but still wet. "Ada built the system, you finished it, and it saved them. That's her legacy and yours, bound up together." I thought about that, about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone. "What about your legacy?" I asked. Silas laughed, a rough, painful sound that turned into more coughing. "My legacy is you, girl. You and this stove and every trench I helped you dig. That's more than most men get." Miss Hargrove came back in early May. Not with children this time. Not with a request for warmth or help or shelter. She came alone, in a wagon, carrying something in her hands that I couldn't see until she was standing at my door. "May I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. She sat at my table, the same table where I'd read Ada's ledgers, where I'd made soup for freezing children, where I'd cried over a letter that should have changed my life and never reached me. She set down what she was carrying, an envelope, yellowed with age, and a folded piece of paper. "I have a confession," she said. I waited. "Your aunt wrote to me, in 1912, 3 years before she died. She asked about you specifically, Ruth Rowan's girl, she called you. She wanted to know if you were bookish, like your mother. She offered to take you in, to train you, to leave you her property and her work." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. "I filed the letter away," Miss Hargrove continued. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "I didn't answer it. I didn't tell you about it. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting your chances for a respectable situation. I thought placing a girl with an eccentric old woman in the hills would ruin your future." She pushed the envelope across the table. I recognized it instantly. The same envelope I'd found in Ada's chest, the same handwriting, but this one had a postmark. This one had been mailed. "There were 2 letters," Miss Hargrove said. "The one she never sent, which you found, and this one, which she did send. To me, in March of 1912. I opened the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a letter, longer than the one in the chest. Ada had written 3 pages describing her work, her hopes, her loneliness, describing the winter nights she spent alone, wishing she had someone to teach, describing me, or rather, describing the girl she imagined I might be, based on stories Ruth had told her years before. "I'm getting old," Ada wrote near the end. "My work is nearly finished, but I cannot complete it alone. I need young hands and a young mind. I need someone who sees what I see, that the problem is never simply the cold, but the path we let the cold take. If Ruth's girl has even half of Ruth's curiosity, she would be perfect." I put the letter down. "She asked for me." "Yes." "She asked for me, and you threw it away." "I didn't throw it away. I filed it. I told myself I might answer later, when you were older, when circumstances were different." Miss Hargrove's voice cracked. "But I never did. And then she died. And I told myself it was for the best." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had controlled my life for years, who had decided which families I would live with and which ones would send me back, who had stood in front of a room full of people and called my inheritance a cruel joke. She was old, older than I'd realized. The winter had aged her, or maybe I was just seeing her clearly for the first time. "You stole 3 years of my life," I said. "Maybe more. You stole the chance to know her, to learn from her, to not be alone." "I know." "You could have told me at any time, after she died, when the will was read, any time in the past 3 years." "I know." I thought about the children I'd warmed in my cabin, the same children she was responsible for. The same children who would have frozen without my help that I only had to give because Ada had built the system and I had finished it. "I forgive you," I said. Miss Hargrove looked up, startled. I forgive you because I am done living in the path of what you withheld. I stood up and opened the door. But I think you should go now. She went. She didn't argue. She didn't thank me. She just gathered her things and walked to her wagon and drove away without looking back. I never saw her again. She died the following winter of pneumonia in the same building where she'd told me the dead had played a cruel joke. Someone else delivered the news. I didn't attend the funeral, but I kept her letter. I kept it with Ada's ledgers, proof of a connection that should have been and almost wasn't. Silus died on a Thursday afternoon in late spring of 1918. I found him on my porch, sitting in the chair we'd put there for him, hat on his knee, face turned toward the afternoon sun. He looked peaceful. He looked like he'd just closed his eyes for a moment and never opened them again. I sat with him for a while. An hour, maybe longer. I held his hand, which was still warm, and I talked to him about the things we'd built together, the trench, the pipe, the collar connection, the shed floor, all the small improvements that had made the difference between surviving and freezing. You were right, I told him. This is your legacy too, every piece of it. Then I went to get help. We buried him on the slope above the shed, where he could hear the splitting, he'd always said. I put his mason's level in the coffin with him. I planted wintertime on the grave, and a sugar maple sapling that I dug up from the edge of the clearing. He left me his tools, his mule, and a cigar tin full of saved stove fittings and bolts. With those fittings, I improved 3 more stoves that summer. With those tools, I taught myself to do the work he'd done for me. I married Nathan Hale in 1921. He was a widowed blacksmith from Second Creek, a man who listened more than he talked and never laughed at a diagram. He saw my ledgers once and asked intelligent questions. That was enough. We had 3 children. They grew up in the warm cabin on the ridge, playing on floors that never froze, sleeping in beds that didn't collect frost on the quilt edges. By 1922, 7 homes in the valley used versions of my system. By 1928, Professor Vale's circular had carried the idea to neighboring counties. People I'd never met wrote letters asking about pipe sizes and trench depths, and I answered everyone. I became known for stove setting and draft fixing. Women came from as far as Raynell to have me look at their kitchens. Men who'd laughed at Ada Wren brought their sons to learn from me. The county extension office asked me to teach a workshop. I taught 3 over the years, always crediting Ada by name. My hands changed. They calloused in places I'd never expected, grew strong in ways I hadn't imagined. By the time I was 40, they knew every stove in Laurel Fork by touch. By the time I was 60, they could diagnose a draft problem with eyes closed. I kept Ada's ledgers. I kept Silas's tools. I kept the letter that should have reached me and the letter that never did. I kept everything that mattered. I died on a Tuesday in late March of 1954. It was a cold, bright day, the kind that makes you think winter is over and then surprises you with one last frost. I was sitting on the shed step with split kindling in my lap, resting between loads. My daughter found me there an hour later, leaned back against the doorframe like I was watching the clouds. She looked peaceful, Mary told people afterward. She looked like she was still listening to a fire. The cabin still stands. My grandson runs it now, him and his wife and their 2 children. The system still works, the same pipe, the same shed floor, the same principle Ada figured out 70 years ago. The floor still doesn't freeze. The fire still draws steady. The cold still can't take the path it wants to take. In the main room, above the stove collar, there's a framed page from Ada's winter ledgers. It's the entry from December of 1906, the one I read by candlelight in a freezing loft when I was 16 years old and had nothing in the world but a sack of cornmeal and 3 stolen pamphlets. What freezes a room is not always the cold outside, it reads. Sometimes it is the path you let the cold take. Next to it, in a smaller frame, is the letter Ada wrote to Miss Hargrove, the one that was mailed and filed and never answered. Proof that she asked for me. Proof that she saw what I might become before I became it. And next to that, in a frame I made myself from salvaged wood, is a copy of Professor Vale's circular, the one that credited Ada Wren for the original design and Eliza Rowan for the completion, the the one that said, in official language, that what we built was real and sound and worth knowing about. I remember the day they read Ada's will. I remember the laughter in the assembly room, the way it bounced off the walls and filled the space like something physical. I remember Miss Hargrove's voice. I suppose even the dead can play a cruel joke. She was wrong. The dead don't play jokes, the dead leave instructions. The dead leave journals and diagrams and letters and hope. The dead leave everything they learned in the cold, dark places they explored alone, and they pray that somebody, anybody will find it and finish what they started. I found it. I finished it. And now I want to ask you something. What cold has been coming into your life through a path you've never examined? Not just temperature, not just weather. I mean the kind of cold that makes people small, the kind that settles in your bones and tells you that you're worthless, that your ideas are foolish, that the thing you inherited, the skill, the curiosity, the stubbornness that makes you different is a liability instead of a gift. What trench have you been afraid to dig because the work looked ugly from above? What system have you been afraid to build because everyone around you said it couldn't work? I was 16 years old. I had nothing. I inherited 11 acres of rock that everyone called a cruel joke, and I turned it into the warmest room in the valley. I didn't do it by being smart. I did it by being stubborn. I did it by reading the notes of someone who came before me, someone who'd been mocked and dismissed and laughed at, just like I was, and trusting that she knew what she was talking about. The conditions were never perfect. They almost never are. The ground was frozen. The tools were broken. The people who should have helped me laughed instead. But the work got done because I did it anyway. Find the path the cold has been taking through your life. Trace it back to its source. Look at where it enters and why. Look at what you've been told about yourself, about your chances, about the worthless inheritance you've been carrying around like a burden instead of recognizing it for what it really is. Then change the path. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own cold rooms and buried pipes and letters that never got answered, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives out of the nothing they were given. And if you're not sure you can do it, if you're sitting there thinking that your situation is different, that your trench is too deep, that your rocks are too hard, remember this. Ada Wren dug alone for 24 years. She died before she finished. And a